As you might guess, group policy processing is going to occur in a certain way by default, and we're going to learn those default actions that group policies will have on objects. But notice from the title of this nugget, Configure Group Policy Processing, you and I are going to have complete control over exactly how group policy gets processed on an object. If it's convenient for you to do so, fire up the hands-on lab and log into DCNUG1. Let's get into DCNUG1 and let's create a couple of organizational units that we can use to practice with the group policy object processing. So let's go into Server Manager as soon as you get logged in, and from the Tools menu, we'll go to the Active Directory Users and Computers tool, and as I said, we'll just quickly create a couple of OUs that we can work with here. Let's create a sales organizational unit, as we did in the previous nugget, and then inside of that OU, let's create another organizational unit, and we'll call it NA Sales for like North America. So here we go. We'll click on our domain, we'll right-click, we'll choose New, we'll go to Organizational Unit, and we'll go ahead and create the Sales OU. Then inside of the Sales OU, we'll right-click, choose New, go to Organizational Unit, and we'll do the NA Sales sub-OU of the Sales OU. Awesome. Now let's go back to Server Manager, and we're going to, of course, go to the Group Policy Management tool. The first thing we need to consider is what happens when you assign multiple group policies to an object. What's going to happen as far as conflicts go and the processing of those conflicts? Who would win if there's a conflict? Well, let me show you that. Here's our Sales OU with its NA Sales sub-OU. Let's right-click the Sales OU and let's create a GPO in this domain and link it here. We'll just call it Sales1 and say OK. And then we'll right-click and we'll create a GPO in this domain and link it here, and this will be Sales 2. So we have two GPOs that are linked to this sales object. So what is going to take precedence if there's a conflict? And understand, if there's no conflict, well, no worries. If you configure, for instance, the computer settings in Sales 1 and the user settings in Sales 2, then they'll mesh together and merge for that object, and there's no conflict. But notice it is the link order that does the precedence when there is a conflict. So we can take this Sales 1 GPO and we can move it down, and now it is not going to have precedence from a conflict perspective. I'll move it back up because we actually want it to be the highest priority GPO linked to this object. So reviewing where we're at here, we've got the Sales OU with the Sales 1 and the Sales 2 GPOs applied. Sales 1 will take precedence if there's any conflicts. Is that the only group policy object settings that are applying to sales? And the answer is, of course, no. Because up top here, we have the default domain policy, and it's having settings that are flowing down and affecting the Sales OU. This is a process called inheritance. So we're going to inherit the settings from the default domain policy. Now, the last applied would win out. So Sales 1, if there's a conflict, is going to win out over some conflicting setting in the default domain policy. But here's something interesting. What if you literally don't want the default domain policy to come in and get involved with the Sales OU? Well, we can block the inheritance feature. To do that, we right-click the OU and we simply choose Block Inheritance. Notice there is an exclamation point now on the Sales OU inside of Group Policy Management, and this exclamation point is trying to tell us, wow, you are not inheriting settings from group policy objects that are above you in the infrastructure. Pretty cool. Now, if you can block inheritance, you would hope there's a way you could override that for some critical policy that you don't want blocked, and there is. It's more powerful than inheritance blocking. It will override it. It's called GPO enforcement. If you go to your default domain policy and you right-click it, first of all, let's get rid of that message. If we right-click the default domain policy and say enforced, now there's a padlock symbol on that GPO, and now it is going to flow down and affect sales. For instance, if we click on sales now and say group policy inheritance tab, if we click on that tab, we'll see because of the enforcement, the default domain policy is flowing down to this entity. And in fact, look at this. Because we enforced it, it went all the way to the top of the precedence. This wouldn't have ordinarily taken place. Let's confirm that. So let's right-click here and we'll undo the blocking of inheritance. Let's right click and undo the enforcement of the default domain policy. So now what we're going to do is refresh things. So we'll click on the sales organizational unit again. And if we look at group policy inheritance, now it's back to normal. Sales 1 is the most highest precedence, sales 2, and then the default domain policy is third precedence. So notice we influenced that dramatically when we enforced the default domain policy. Now here's a question for us. If we were to enact these group policy objects on the sales organizational unit, do they affect every single user inside the sales OU? And of course the answer is yes. So an obvious question becomes, can we filter that kind of situation? And we can. We like to call this simply security filtering. Watch this. If we go down to the group policy objects node and we go to like the sales 1 GPO, we can see the permissions that are assigned to various entities. If you go to advanced and you look in here, you can see that the authenticated users have read and they have apply group policy assigned. So if we were to go in and deny read and deny apply group policy, now we are overriding permissions for all the authenticated users, and then we could add a specific user account and give them the allow permissions respectively. So that would be a model where we are just applying group policy object settings to one user account. You could do the opposite approach, of course. You could add a user account inside here and do the deny, and now the group policy object settings apply to everyone except that one user. So be aware that we can go in and do filtering based on security settings. You can even get fancier than that, though, when it comes to filtering, thanks to the Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI, approach. Watch this. If we go to the WMI filters area inside of Group Policy Management, you can go in and you can create a query that would literally look at things like, how about the version of operating system that's in use? So you could say, all right, it has to be Windows 10. So you could write a query that specifies Windows 10. And obviously you don't need to know how to script in this certification environment, so I won't cover it with you, but this is where you would place your script. Then what you do is you go to the group policy object that you want to tie to that script, and on the scope tab, when you select that group policy object in the group policy objects node, notice you can tie that WMI filter right here to that group policy object. So this is a great way to have conditions met for the group policy to take effect, like the classic example would be the version of operating system that's in use. Now let's talk a user's desktop settings for a moment, shall we? This is something we love to do with group policy. So you have this user and they're in an organizational unit to which we have applied a GPO, and that GPO includes their desktop settings. If they log into a computer that is inside that GPO, sure enough, they're going to get their standard desktop. And how Microsoft set this up is if they log into a computer that is in another OU and there's a GPO assigned to that OU, they're going to get their standard desktop, because the settings they get is going to be for the OU in which the user account lives. But what if this computer is like a kiosk system and you want them to get a standard kiosk type desktop? So you want the default behavior of group policy overridden here. Well, there is a way to do this, and this is what we call loopback processing. And we're going to see just how easy it is to set this up, overriding the default behavior for a user's desktop based on their user account location inside of Active Directory. So let's do this. Let's go into our group policy management area here, and let's go ahead and create a GPO and link it to the NA sales organizational unit. And we'll go ahead and call this NA sales GPO. So there we go. We've got this new group policy object that we can work with. We're going to right click it and choose edit. And what we're looking for is inside the GPO where we can specify this type of loopback processing for this GPO. So in the editor, we're going to go to the computer configuration node. And that makes sense because this is something that we want happening when any user goes onto this computer. And under that node, we're going to go to policies and then administrative templates. And then we're going to go to the system node. And then inside the system node, we're going to go to the group policy folder. There's so many settings here under group policy. Let's alphabetize this list. And when we do so, we should see configure user group policy loopback processing mode. Inside of this setting, notice we can enable this, and then we can say, are we going to merge the group policy behavior or replace the group policy behavior? And of course, we would be interested in doing a replace for the scenario I described, where the desktop that is presented for any user account that logs into this kiosk computer is going to be set up for that kiosk computer. We say, okay. And we have just enabled the loopback processing mode for our group policy object. Now, there are two more settings that we are responsible for when it comes to group policy object processing, and they're in the same location where we just were. So you might say, Anthony, why did you have me close that? Well, I had you close it because it could serve us well to have practice on how to find those settings. So let's do it. We're going to go to the North American Sales GPO. We're going to right-click it, and we're going to choose Edit. And this brings up the Group Policy Management Editor, of course. We are going to the same location we were before: Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System, and we remember there's this Group Policy node with all these many settings. Let's alphabetize this again. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to look at some behavior that's really cool. It's Configure Group Policy Slow Link Detection. If you go in and enable this feature, what will happen is you will set a threshold where the client computer needs to configure the link, or consider the link, I should say, as slow. So 500 kilobits per second is the recommended setting. And you can also say always treat wireless WAN connections as a slow link. And what's going to happen now is if the client is over a wireless WAN, or the client sees the link is slower than 500 kilobits per second, it will not process all of the GPO components. It'll say, I'm going to just pick the critical ones and not worry about what Microsoft considers non-critical ones, like software installation, folder redirection, scripts policy, things that could be labor intensive over this slow WAN link. Pretty cool. So we say okay to this, and we just set that up on this group policy object. A related feature that's also cool is this one: Configure Group Policy Caching. Here, when we enable it, we can say what the slow link value is and what the timeout is. If we hit the timeout value, the client will not attempt to download the group policy object from the server. Instead, it will use a cached copy that it will maintain when we enable this feature. So this is great for slow WAN links, as we indicated, and these are settings that you definitely would want to consider in your environment. So if you're going through these nuggets sequentially, at this point, you're really skilled when it comes to group policy. You can create them, you can manage them, you can deal with things like inheritance and enforcement. And now what we're going to do in the very next nugget is we're going to look at some of the cool things that you can actually perform in your network thanks to group policy objects. It's funny that we haven't really delved into the wonders that are group policy when it comes to getting things done. I'll show you some cool things we can do, like software installation and applying security templates out in your environment. I hope this nugget was informative for you, though, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.